The warm yellow street lamps bled out gentle halos in the dark. 3 years of hidden intimacy ultimately collapsed into a tightly crumpled pregnancy test in Nathan's trembling fingertips. The news of a new life hadn't even slipped past his lips before the shadow known as his first love quietly descended. So, on a windy night, carrying only a small piece of luggage, he vanished alone into the vast, dark unknown. Years later, the afternoon sun pierced the glass walls of a warm greenhouse. A towering, imposing Kevin held a little boy's hand, stopping dead in front of Nathan. Against the blinding backlight, the rigid ice deep in Kevin's eyes melted into a profound, shimmering light. He murmured in a low, husky voice, "Baby, is this your daddy? He looks exactly like the person I've been looking for." Time rewound to 3 years ago. As a thoroughly ordinary beta, Nathan's ability to stay beside Kevin, a premier alpha and billionaire heir, relied entirely on an illusion of sheer luck. Though he held no official title, for those 3 years, he was the absolute only one allowed in Kevin's private domain. The warm afternoon sun filtered through pure white sheer curtains, falling gently onto the thin slip of paper in Nathan's hands. The edges of the paper crinkled slightly beneath his trembling fingertips. He took a deep breath, wanting to gamble a bright future for this unexpected little life, then turned and pushed open the door. Navigating the blinding lights and deafening pulse of the club hallway, Nathan finally stopped before a heavy, carved wooden door. The dim yellow sconces stretched his shadow long against the wall. He rolled the paper into a tight ball, pressing it hard into his palm, a cold sweat already soaking through the back of it. Just as he raised his hand to push the door open, the voices seeping through the crack nailed him mid-air. "Isaac should be back soon, right? Kevin, when are you going to propose to him?" Nathan's pupils contracted violently, his extended fingers curling rigidly into a fist. Who was Isaac? Kevin was proposing. Yeah, Kevin. You've been carrying that ring close to your chest for years. When are you finally giving it to him? The laughter from inside felt like a blunt knife. Nathan bit his lower lip so hard the color drained from it, leaving a ghostly white. He had always thought the freezing detachment surrounding Kevin was just his nature, a proud isolation to escape his family's pressure to marry. It turned out it was only because that particular name wasn't by his side. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked from his lungs. He stared dead at the crack in the door, praying to hear that familiar, cold denial. Silence fell over the room. The originally warm orange light in the hallway suddenly seemed coated in a sickly, pale hue. In that suffocating, freezing silence, Kevin's deep, absolute voice cut through. Soon, in a few days. The room instantly erupted in loud cheering. Outside, it felt as though a heavy layer of frost had formed on Nathan's eyelashes, his eyes slowly turning a bruised red. Suddenly, someone inside asked, "Then what about your lover?" If Isaac finds out, he probably won't be happy. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. Nathan stopped breathing entirely. The frost seeping through the door crack thickened, freezing every sound around him. Kevin's voice held zero warmth. It was clean and utterly ruthless. Sent him back to where he came from. The discussion inside continued: who would take the photos, who would set up the venue. Outside, Nathan felt as if his spine had been ripped out. The crumpled pregnancy test slipped from his palm. He scrambled frantically to pick it up, guarding it tightly against his chest. He hunched over, stumbling backward into the dark depths of the hallway like a routed moth, his vision blurred with moisture. At the corner, Nathan slammed hard into a broad chest. "You?" A magnetic, lazy voice drifted from above. Nathan blankly lifted his slightly red eyes. The man standing before him was incredibly tall. His red dress shirt hung casually open, his chest faintly visible in the dim orange shadows. A pair of liquid, deeply affectionate eyes stared at him with intense interest. The man radiated a dominant, wild energy that felt as if it could set everything ablaze, causing Nathan to instinctively take a half step back. Swallowing the second half of his apology, he turned to leave, but the man chuckled, leaning in close. With a single flick of his long fingers, he snatched the warm slip of paper right out of Nathan's hand. The air around them vibrated violently from the man's inescapable proximity, the lighting flickering unsteadily. "No wonder you look like a ghost." You're pregnant? The man's gaze instantly turned predatory and amused, waving the paper between his knuckles. Let me guess, the baby's daddy wouldn't happen to be in there, would he? Like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, Nathan lunged forward, snatching the paper back and clutching it tightly against his heart. None of your damn business. Get the hell away from me. The corners of his eyes were red, his voice carrying a faint, almost imperceptible tremble. The man didn't get angry. He merely shrugged, a cynical, highly amused smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Look at you, still as fiery as ever. Nathan gritted his teeth, dropping his voice to a low warning. You've got the wrong guy, before bolting in a blind panic. Behind him, the man's gaze lingered, piercing through the distorted air, impossibly deep and entirely unreadable. Pushing open the door to his empty room in a daze, a gentle yet freezing beam of moonlight spilled through the window. Nathan curled himself deep into the farthest corner of the sofa, his fingertips unconsciously tracing his flat stomach. In the dead silence, he closed his eyes. The faint blue glow of his phone screen illuminated Nathan's slightly pale face. The exquisite mousse cake on the table remained unopened, the sweet, heavy scent of cream hanging coldly in the dim room. On the other end of the line, Kevin's voice was completely devoid of emotion. I'm not coming back tonight. I had someone drop off that cake you like. Nathan should have answered with his usual, docile obedience, but his fingernails dug ruthlessly into his palms, piercing the flesh. In the flickering halo of the screen, he forced the words through a dry, trembling throat, crossing a line he never had before. Mr. Kevin, do you have someone you love? The line instantly filled with heavy, dead silence. Even through the radio waves, Nathan could feel the air in the room violently pulled away. The temperature plummeted. A dense layer of visible, freezing frost suddenly crawled across the window pane, shattering the neon city lights outside into disjointed fragments. Beep, the dial tone echoed. The call had been ruthlessly cut off. He had felt this exact kind of suffocation once before. It was an afternoon wrapped in a soft, molten gold sunset, the two of them standing before massive floor-to-ceiling windows. When Nathan boldly asked if he had ever fallen for anyone, the relaxed, warm curve of Kevin's lips instantly turned to ice. The surrounding warmth was violently driven out by an invisible, spreading chill. The man's sharp jawline tightened dangerously, his gaze cutting like a blade. Nathan, remember your place. Never ask questions you shouldn't ask. Now, the dial tone echoed in the empty room. Driven by an intense, burning ache, Nathan pushed open the heavy doors of the study he had always treated as strictly forbidden. The brass handle gave a dry, protesting creak. In the gloom, he switched on a warm yellow desk lamp. The light drove away the shadows, but mercilessly illuminated an old, slightly faded photograph tucked deep in the back of a drawer. In the photo, a tall alpha in a high school uniform stood next to a boy with a blindingly bright smile. On the back, a single line was written, "I hope we both get the future we want, Isaac." Clutching the photo, Nathan stumbled backward until he reached the full-length mirror in the hallway. Under the dim sconce, his pale, bloodless face in the mirror cruelly overlapped with the boy in the photograph. In that exact second, the corners of his eyes flushed a devastating red. He finally understood. These 3 years of peace and staying by his side had absolutely nothing to do with luck. It was only because he possessed a face that was strikingly similar. The night grew impossibly heavy, the cold moonlight draping over the messy bedsheets like a thin veil. Nathan thrashed violently, soaked in a cold sweat. In his nightmare, Kevin's eyes were encrusted with ice, freezing the very air in the room into a ghastly white fog. The man stared down at him from an insurmountable height, looking at him as if he were less than dust. Remember your place. You're just a beta. The only one allowed to carry my child is Isaac. No. Nathan jerked awake, his chest heaving violently as he gasped for air. The warm tears bleeding from the corners of his eyes glimmered faintly under the cold moon. His trembling hands slowly tightened, ultimately cradling his flat stomach with a fierce, unwavering tenderness. This was a living, breathing little life, his only true family in this world. Having witnessed Kevin's absolute ruthless domination in the business world, he knew he couldn't let this child be erased. If he couldn't fight him, he could certainly run. Under the dim floor lamp, Nathan swiftly unzipped his suitcase. He only folded in a few soft, warm clothes. Those priceless, staggering jewels were left exactly as they were, untouched in their cold velvet boxes. The moment he pulled the zipper shut, he looked around the room filled with 3 years of traces. Those memories he had foolishly believed to be tender flashed quickly through his mind, the soft kisses Kevin pressed behind his ear in the heat of passion, that low, melting whisper of Nono, and their very first meeting, when the alpha's pheromones spiraled out of control, creating a violently freezing blizzard inside the room. As a beta, Nathan had walked through that terrifying phenomena with suppressants in hand, heading straight into the blinding light toward that incredibly dangerous man. It turned out all that tenderness was just a stolen, illusory dream. Outside the glass walls of the departure lounge, the rising morning sun cast a massive expanse of warm, orange light, driving away the bone, deep chill of the long night. The phone in his pocket vibrated abruptly. The screen lit up with a message from Kevin. "I'm leaving for a business trip. Be back in about 3 days. Need me to bring anything back?" The cursor blinked in the text box. Even when treating a hidden stand-in, Kevin always maintained this gentle, phantom-like consideration. Nathan's eyelashes fluttered lightly. He lowered his gaze, masking the very last trace of lingering attachment and sorrow in his eyes. His fingertips tapped steadily across the screen. "Don't bring anything. If possible, I'd rather go on the trip with you." The second it sent, without a single shred of hesitation, he ruthlessly held down the power button. The black screen reflected his slightly red yet sunlit eyes. He grabbed his suitcase, turned, and stepped straight into the warm, golden light, never looking back. After a 20-hour transatlantic flight, the warm sun of a foreign town filtered through the wooden window frames, casting dappled, gentle pools of light across the hardwood floor. Standing beside the bed, Nathan's fingertips abruptly froze mid-air as he rummaged through his coat pockets. That thin pregnancy test was gone. After a brief moment of panic, he collapsed backward onto the soft mattress, letting the mild sunlight wrap around his slight frame. Knowing Kevin's ruthlessly cold and stringent boundaries, he would never bother sifting through the belongings left behind by a mere stand-in. And even if he did find it, the lofty billionaire heir would never scour the earth searching for him. He lowered his eyelashes, his pale fingertips gently pressing against his flat stomach, letting out a silent sigh into the quiet, warm light. From now on, they only had each other to rely on. Life in this foreign land moved at a slow, peaceful pace. The climate was mild and forgiving. That was until one day Stephen, a fellow beta from his home country who was also experiencing life abroad, burst into this tranquility, carrying 2 steaming cups of black tea. "Did you see? The heir of the Smith family got completely scammed," Stephen said, his face animated, as he pointed to his lit-up phone screen. The moment the screen lit up, the warm light in the room seemed instantly, violently sucked away. On the display, Kevin's dark, frostbitten face was captured and magnified. Even though it was just a cluster of pixels, Nathan felt the surrounding temperature plummet. It was as if Kevin's inescapable pheromones had surrounded him. The air at the edges of his vision began to condense into tiny, sharp ice crystals. That deeply familiar bone-chilling frost snaked its way up his spine, gripping him tight. "I heard he was scammed out of his money and his feelings, and now Hez searching everywhere like a madman." Stephen's words blurred into a dull, heavy buzz in Nathan's ears. Kevin couldn't care less about money. This kind of reckless, unhinged madness was something that utterly cold, calculating man would never do. The only explanation, he had seen the pregnancy test. Nathan yanked his hand back, pressing it fiercely against his stomach, his pale fingertips digging deep into the soft fabric. He didn't dare imagine the kind of judgment he and his child would face if that absolute, freezing blizzard ever descended upon them again. "I'm just curious how beautiful that Omega must be to make a premier alpha lose his mind like that." Stephen took a sip of tea, completely oblivious. "They say only a top-tier Omega, the kind whose presence alone makes the air bloom with cascades of glowing roses, could ever be worthy of him." It was true. In everyone's eyes, only an existence like that could ever be worthy of Kevin. Nathan's face turned deathly pale. Forcing down the slight tremor in his fingertips, his eyelashes fluttering uneasily, he interrupted Stephen. "Stop gossiping. Come with me to the clinic. I've been getting dizzy a lot lately." The days that followed seemed set to fast forward. The gentle smile of the doctor at the clinic, the awkward expression on Stephen's face as he carried out a pot of unrecognizable scorched matter, and the gleaming new pot that eventually replaced it. In the newly tilled garden out front, greenery quietly spread under the sun. The wisteria hanging over the porch bloomed and faded, and the passage of time only grew milder. During those afternoons wrapped in warm golden light, Nathan would sink quietly into the soft wicker chair. Dressed in oversized, comfortable knitwear, his hand would rest softly over his daily swelling belly, even the slight furrow between his brows, completely smoothing out in the tranquility. Until one afternoon, when this warm painting was violently ripped apart. The air in the courtyard abruptly twisted and warped. It was like asphalt baking under extreme heat at high noon. Even the delicate green leaves curled slightly under the invisible, scorching pressure. The bright, sunny light around them was brutally dragged into an incredibly aggressive, heavy dark orange hue. The alpha in the red shirt he had met once before, Joseph, stepped onto the wooden stairs of the porch, his arms crossed, carrying an aura of searing heat that seemed to be quietly reducing everything around him to ash. "You're the bastard who knocked Nathan up and didn't take responsibility?" Completely blind to the lethal tension, Stephen stepped in front of Nathan like a protective mother hen, yelling furiously. The corners of Joseph's deeply affectionate eyes twitched slightly. The distorted dark orange heat wave around him surged aggressively forward. Yet he merely shot an amused glance past Stephen, locking his eyes dead onto the round curve of Nathan's belly. "Well, if you put it that way, then of course I have to take responsibility for the child. How did you find me here?" Nathan bolted up from the wicker chair, instinctively wrapping his arms tightly around his stomach. His jawline was pulled incredibly tight, his defensive posture exactly like that of a startled deer. His biological father's blizzard is freezing the other side of the ocean solid. As his arch rival, isn't it perfectly reasonable for me to come crash the party early? Joseph casually stepped onto the final stair, the dark orange halo around him vibrating slightly with his movements. "You told Kevin?" Nathan's breathing instantly lost its rhythm, his pupils shrinking in absolute panic. Joseph shrugged, dispersing a fraction of his dominating aura. "I wish I had. But if you don't want to be found by that walking glacier, you'd better leave with me right now." The sun began to dip, stretching the three twisted, chaotic shadows across the wooden floor. Nathan felt a faint, uneasy kick from the fetus, a tiny flutter that instantly magnified the terror in his heart. He feared Kevin's retaliation, but he was far more terrified of losing this child. Gritting his teeth, his gaze cutting past the obstructing Stephen, he stared unblinkingly at the alpha standing in the center of the searing heat, asking his final question with a trembling voice. "Joseph, what exactly are you after?" Joseph tilted his head. The dark orange light danced with reckless, burning sparks in his eyes. A highly amused, wicked smirk curled his lips. "Being able to make Kevin suffer a living hell. That is more than enough." A flight across half the globe was condensed into a few overlapping boarding passes, and the deep, jet-lagged sleep upon landing. Just as Joseph had said, the most dangerous place is the safest. Nathan, along with a shamelessly tag-along Stephen, quietly hid themselves away in a highly private, heavily guarded villa back in their home country. The daily bickering between the alpha and the beta, fighting over the title of future godfather, dissolved into the comforting background noise beneath the villa's perpetually warm orange lighting. Until the third day after returning, when this peaceful warmth was violently shredded by a freezing screen. The tablet cast a ghostly blue glow, displaying the little wooden house with the yard in the foreign country. On the screen, Kevin was staring dead at the tightly shut door. His previously immaculate haute couture suit was covered in wrinkles. His eyes, heavily shot with red, radiated a terrifying, inescapable obsession. Even across thousands of miles, that horrifying domination seemed to brutally force its way through the connection, around the edges of the tablet. A ring of visible, ghastly white frost actually crystallized. The bone, chilling air, nearly freezing the very fingertips Nathan used to hold the device. "I will find you. I promise you that." The man on the screen silently mouthed the words with zero emotion. Nathan shuddered violently and immediately blacked out the screen. He buried himself deep within a thick cashmere blanket, his eyelashes trembling fiercely with anxiety. He forced himself to swallow the bitter ache rising in his throat. What was there left to hold on to? He was just a beta. He needed to remember his place. Spring faded into autumn. The ivy climbing the courtyard walls turned from green to yellow. 3 years slipped quietly by, measured in the clatter of keyboard strokes and the cries of a baby. The warm afternoon sun pierced the floor to ceiling windows, casting bright, square pools of light across the carpet. 3-year-old Jonathan sat in the glow building blocks. His straight nose and deep-set eyes were practically a miniaturized carbon copy of Kevin. Having saved up enough royalties from his writing, Nathan stood at the top of the stairs holding a glass of warm water, watching Stephen and Joseph bicker over how to mix Jonathan's formula downstairs. At some unknown point, the lethal tension between those two had melted away, morphing into an inseparable, sticky dance of light and shadow. Even the aggressive, dark, orange heat wave that used to surround Joseph had softened, becoming as warm and mild as a hearth fire. Nathan chuckled lightly and shook his head. It was time for him, the ultimate third wheel, to make his exit. Life after moving out of the villa was as calm as lukewarm water. One evening, the sunset dyed the living room of their new home a soft, rosy hue. Jonathan, fresh from his first day of kindergarten, leaned over the edge of the bed, his large eyes shining brightly. "Daddy, I saw a really handsome uncle at the kindergarten gate today." The little guy reached up with his chubby fingers, scratching his cheek in confusion. But he was really weird. He kept staring at me, and as he stared, his eyes got all red, and he started crying. Nathan's heart slammed violently against his ribs. The flush of his low-grade fever instantly drained, leaving his cheeks pale. He forced a stiff smile, wrapping his son's soft little hands within his own. His voice was gentle, yet laced with an imperceptible tight strain. "Jonathan, there are a lot of bad people out there lately. If you see strange people you don't know, absolutely never go near them. Go straight to your teacher, okay?" "Got it." Jonathan nodded obediently, his warm palm pressed against Nathan's burning forehead. "Big Daddy and Little Papa went on a trip, so Daddy needs to sleep and be good while I go to school." The bedroom door clicked shut quietly. The dizziness from his fever washed over him like a heavy tide, dragging Nathan back into an endless sea of sleep. In the dim room, Nathan's brows furrowed slightly, his breathing heavy and burning. Yet, in his dreams, the light and shadows were blindingly bright. It was Kevin's youth, a youth he had never been a part of. On a basketball court drenched in golden sunlight, a teenage Kevin in his school uniform turned around, full of high-spirited energy. Shimmering sweat clung to the hair on his forehead, the smile on his lips more dazzling than the scorching summer sun. The scene shifted. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark glow of an internet cafe, laughing together over the clacking of keyboards. It was a vibrant, fiercely alive Kevin that Nathan had never seen. Yet in this moment, it overwhelmingly saturated his senses, feeling incredibly real. In reality, a single warm tear quietly slipped from the corner of Nathan's tightly shut eyes, quickly disappearing into the soft pillow. He greedily drowned himself in this fabricated, illusory dream of youth, falling into a deep, deep sleep. The autumn wind swept up a sky full of golden leaves, spiraling through the empty afternoon streets. Nathan, his face deathly pale, sprinted wildly through the falling leaves, his heels clicking a frantic, stumbling rhythm against the cobblestones. The news of a violent intruder slipping into the kindergarten's lockdown drill had instantly drained every ounce of warmth from his body, until he reached the street corner, and that deeply familiar, time-stopping freezing mist washed over him. The swirling yellow leaves eerily suspended in mid-air, their edges quietly coated in a thin layer of frost, refracting shattered icy light under the autumn sun. Kevin stood at the epicenter of the frost, his towering, imposing frame blocking out every bit of the biting autumn wind. With one arm, he held a perfectly safe Jonathan. With the other, he gently stroked the child's soft hair. The man's impossibly deep eyes pierced through the fine ice crystals, locking dead onto Nathan's frozen body. "Baby, is this your daddy?" Kevin's voice was hoarse, trembling slightly. The rigid ice that had built up in the depths of his eyes for 3 years shattered inch by inch, melting into a scalding, inescapable undercurrent. He looks exactly like the person I've been looking for. Daddy. Jonathan wiggled free, launching himself into Nathan's arms like a little cannonball. The string that had been pulled to its absolute limit suddenly snapped. The second Nathan's trembling fingertips brushed against his son's warm cheek, the streetscape before him began to violently warp and distort. Before completely plummeting into darkness, he fell weightlessly into an embrace that carried the chilling scent of frost and snow, yet was overwhelmingly broad and scalding hot. When he woke up again, the hospital room was bathed in gentle, warm afternoon sunlight. Kevin sat in the shadows opposite the hospital bed. 3 years of time had stripped away the last traces of youth from his brow. His jawline was pulled as tight as a drawn bow. At the boundary of light and shadow, those red-rimmed eyes seized Nathan with an absolute, irresistible magnetism. "Daunt, you have anything to say to me?" The bitter sorrow and inferiority suppressed for 3 years broke like a shattered dam in that exact moment. Nathan gripped the snow, white blanket tightly, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. He pulled his lips into a self-deprecating smirk, but an uncontrollable, devastating flush of red flooded the corners of his eyes, making his slight shoulders tremble violently. "Say what? Say that I fled in a panic back then because I was pregnant with your child? Or say that I know you have a first love named Isaac in your heart, and am nothing but a substitute with a similar face?" Crystal tears smashed against the back of his hand like broken strings. Like a thief caught red-handed, Nathan's forced facade of coldness shattered to pieces. "I don't want to get in your way. You don't have to chase me out. I'll leave on my own." The temperature in the hospital room didn't suddenly plummet. Instead, that inescapable, domineering aura that usually carried a bone, piercing chill transformed into the soft, weightless phenomena of the first snow. Fine, delicate snowflakes materialized out of thin air, glowing with a soft halo under the warm sunlight, tenderly and carefully enveloping the entire hospital bed. Kevin's massive frame leaned over. His warm fingertips, carrying faint calluses, gently brushed away the scalding moisture at the corners of Nathan's eyes. He cupped Nathan's tear-stained face in both hands, his voice laced with a heartbreaking, desperate plea. "No, leaving me back then was incredibly unfair to me. And I never got to be with Isaac either." He paused, every word accompanied by faintly trembling motes of light in the air. "Because you are Isaac." Nathan's pupils contracted violently, followed immediately by an even deeper sense of humiliation and resistance. After a brief, rigid pause, he violently tore away from those warm hands. Like a startled snail, he swiftly shrank back under the covers, clutching the blanket tightly over his ears to block out the incredibly quiet, trembling words of that unreachable alpha. "Don't go. Please don't leave me behind again." In the days that followed, an eerie yet warmly tinted tranquility flowed through the hospital room. The lofty, untouchable heir to the Smith family was now sitting on a small, low stool by the bed, wearing a slightly wrinkled shirt. The gentle sunset outside plated his and Jonathan's silhouettes with a soft rim of gold. One large, one small, 2 faces cut from the exact same mold were huddled in front of a laptop screen, intensely and seriously discussing why egg tarts are delicious. Leaning against the headboard, watching the room fill with this warm light and shadow, the heavy defenses in Nathan's heart quietly melted away without him even realizing. Until one day this warm filter was completely shattered by Jonathan's tears. The little guy leaned over the edge of the bed, his chubby fingers anxiously twisting Nathan's hospital gown. Large, heavy tears smashed against the back of Nathan's hand. "Daddy," I overheard the doctor uncle and the handsome uncle talking. "They said you have something growing in your head, and it's going to make you forget everyone. Can you, please, not forget me?" Nathan's heart violently plummeted. Countless fragmented memories of dizzy spells and fainting, along with those vivid, impossibly real dreams of a teenage Kevin, all violently pieced together into a cruel truth in this exact moment. Forcing down the spasm in his fingertips, he tenderly wiped away his son's tears and managed to pull a strained smile. "I won't. No matter who Daddy forgets, I will never forget you." The night was overwhelmingly deep, the pristine moonlight pouring over the hospital bed like water. The air in the room condensed into fine, dense frost flowers, laced with an endless, devastating sorrow, shimmering with a faint, ghostly glow under the moonlight. Believing Nathan was fast asleep, Kevin's massive frame hunched over the edge of the bed. He wrapped both his hands tightly around Nathan's slightly cool fingertips, pressing them hard against his own forehead. The heavily suppressed, agonizing sobs felt unbearably heavy in the dead of night. Drop by drop, scalding tears smashed into Nathan's palm, shockingly hot. Nathan slowly opened his eyes. Bathed in the liquid moonlight, he watched this once hopelessly arrogant alpha, crying like a devoted believer who had just lost his entire world. "Mr. Kevin, you're crying so heartbrokenly. Am I terminally ill?" Nathan's voice was incredibly soft, yet it instantly shattered the bleak, freezing frost filling the room. He didn't pull his hand back, instead allowing the man to grip it tightly. In this moonlight laced with healing and release, Nathan quietly stared into those red, swollen eyes. "Tell me everything. I'm afraid if I don't listen now, I really won't get another chance." The pristine moonlight cascaded over the bed like a waterfall. The once untouchable Premier Alpha now buried his face deeply in Nathan's palm. His broad back trembled violently in the cold white shadow. Following his broken, choked sobs, the bone, chilling frost that had permanently occupied the room began to shatter inch by inch, melting into threads of warm, soft, shimmering light, blooming in the air like the swaying begonia branches outside the window, casting a visible, tender halo. "You suffered a head injury before. A clot formed, causing you to forget everyone. You only remembered your name was Nathan, and that you were my lover. But we had been together since high school." Kevin looked up, his red-rimmed eyes meeting Nathan's, warm tears sliding down the high bridge of his nose. As his husky voice narrated the past, sealed frames of memory flashed rapidly through Nathan's mind, the romance novel covered in crimson stains, the blank, bewildered look in his eyes when he first woke up, and every single time Kevin had a raging storm hidden in his eyes, yet had to forcibly suppress the chaotic air currents, clench his jaw tight, and wear the mask of a cold, distant sponsor. If he crossed the line even slightly, even with just one extra smile, Nathan would lose control and fall into an agonizing coma. To maintain this fragile, glass-like lie, Kevin had spent countless days and nights forcibly freezing his own profound, absolute love into solid ice. With trembling fingertips, Kevin pulled a stack of worn-edged photographs from his breast pocket. Under the warm yellow wall lamp, the scenes in the photos were instantly brought to life. There was Kevin, awkwardly holding a slightly lopsided birthday cake, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. There was an ice field under a sky ablaze with auroras, where Nathan unapologetically shoved his freezing hands down Kevin's collar, both of them laughing with wild, unrestrained abandon. Nathan stared blankly, tracing the vibrant, smiling face of his past self in the photos. The bitter inferiority that had haunted his heart instantly morphed into an overwhelming sense of absurdity and softness. Like a voyeur, for all these long years, he had actually been fiercely jealous of himself. He raised his eyes, looking at the man before him, who had stripped away every single layer of his disguise. Under the moonlight, Kevin was no longer that untouchable, solitary moon hanging high in the sky. He was a blossoming begonia tree, entirely within reach, blooming just for him. "Will I die?" Nathan gently interrupted him. Kevin shook his head violently, taking a sharp, desperate breath. "No." "Then what are you crying for?" "I'm crying for these past 3 years. You hid away in a foreign country, having Jonathan all by yourself. How much you must have suffered." Kevin gripped Nathan's hand tightly, his knuckles turning a ghostly white from sheer, absolute terror. The gentle begonia halos in the air began to tremble uneasily, betraying the deepest dread in his heart. "The doctor said the surgery isn't guaranteed to be 100% successful. I'm terrified. I'm terrified you'll wake up and forget me all over again. Or even worse, fall in love with someone else." The room fell into a brief, hushed silence. A moment later, Nathan wrapped his hand back around those large, trembling hands, a tender curve lifting the corners of his eyes. "Mr. Kevin, even completely stripped of my memories, my instincts still drove me to fall in love with you all over again. Couldn't you have just a little faith in me? Drop A single, scalding tear smashed against the back of Nathan's hand, right over the faintly visible blue veins, splashing into a tiny, shattered bloom of warm light. A few days later, under the blinding, pale glare of the surgical lights, the pen trembled violently against the surgical consent form. Nathan took a deep breath, forcing down the spasm in his fingertips, and signed his name. The hospital room door was shoved violently open, bringing in the cold draft from the hallway. A travel-worn Stephen stood there with red-rimmed eyes. Behind him was a deeply regretful Joseph. That highly aggressive dark orange heat wave that used to radiate from Joseph was now withered and dim, like a candle on the verge of burning out. How long have we even been gone? How did it get so bad that he needs surgery? Joseph ran his hands through his hair in deep frustration. In those flashes of true memory, beneath Joseph's cynical playboy facade, lay the clumsiest, most fiercely loyal protection for his old friend. Outside the operating room doors, the final second before the red light flicked on, Nathan violently grabbed Kevin's sleeve. He tilted his head up, looking at Kevin's face, a face forcing a smile that looked infinitely more agonizing than tears. He spoke softly, yet with absolute, inescapable resolve. "Stop smiling. It looks awful. Mr. Kevin, if I really don't wake up, or if I completely forget you, just let yourself go. Don't love me anymore." Kevin's pupils contracted violently. Before he could even grasp that fleeting corner of fabric, the heavy doors closed ruthlessly before his eyes. Half a month later, the first snow fell. The crackling fireplace baked the entire villa in a melting, intoxicating warmth. On the massive Christmas tree, colorful lights refracted against the floor to ceiling windows, casting a dreamy, starry glow. Nathan was nestled deep in the soft cashmere sofa, holding his phone. On the screen, Stephen was excitedly inviting him over for Christmas. In the background, Joseph was frantically waving his hands and shaking his head at the camera. Who could have guessed that the mysterious painter Joseph had been so obsessed with the one whose artwork he hoarded at staggering prices was actually this loud, chaotic beta from back home? "I think it'll pass. Jonathan is throwing a fit about spending Christmas as just the three of us." Nathan chuckled softly and hung up the call. The words had barely left his lips when a broad, scalding chest pressed seamlessly against his back. Kevin rested his chin in the crook of Nathan's neck. The air flowing around him radiated a lazy, comfortable heat like the winter sun, completely driving away the bitter chill beyond the glass. This billionaire heir, who had dumped his entire empire onto his elderly father just to become Nathan's full-time shadow, grumbled as he nuzzled his nose against the side of Nathan's neck. On the phone with that bastard Joseph again. Tell him to get the hell lost. He was still holding a massive grudge over Joseph hiding Nathan away all those years ago. "All right, let's head into our room and properly plan out how we're going to spend Christmas." Kevin pulled him into a tight, inescapable embrace. His long, defined fingers restlessly hooked beneath the hem of Nathan's sweater. His lowered voice carried a dangerous, magnetic hint of domination. "I ordered an outfit. You'll look absolutely breathtaking in it. Want to try it on tonight?" Recalling those incredibly scanty online purchase receipts, the tips of Nathan's ears instantly burned, a fierce, flushed red. He slapped a hand over those wandering fingers, his eyes widening in flustered embarrassment. "Jonathan is still downstairs. Control yourself. That little brat." Kevin narrowed his eyes and let out a cold snort. The air instantly filled with a thick, sour wave of pure jealousy. "The very first time he met me, he actually said he was going to find you a new husband. I'm still keeping score on that one." Looking at this premier alpha acting so ridiculously childish, actually competing with his own son for affection, Nathan couldn't help but laugh out loud. He turned around, wrapping his arms around Kevin's neck. Amidst those continuously rising, warm halos of light, he tilted his head up, his eyes reflecting the brilliant, starry Christmas lights. "After all the twists and turns in the end, it's still you, isn't it?" Outside the window, a heavy snowstorm swirled through the night. But inside, bathed in the warmth of the roaring fire, their shadows tightly, inescapably intertwined.
This is where Kevin and Nathan's story comes to an end. Did you ever expect that Nathan was the one Kevin had locked away in his heart all along? The entire story unfolds from Nathan's perspective, and at the very beginning, when we found out Kevin was hiding someone else in his heart, our hearts broke for Nathan. After all, Kevin treated him with such flawless, overwhelming tenderness. It was impossible not to fall for him. But if Kevin was merely using him as a stand-in for his true love, that would have been an unbearably cruel fate. Yet, as the story progressed, the truth slowly came to light. The one Kevin loved was Nathan. It had always been Nathan. But to protect him, Kevin had no choice but to bury his profound, consuming love deep in the shadows. Looking back, I actually think Nathan is the luckiest person in this entire story. He has Kevin's absolute, unwavering devotion and a circle of friends who fiercely and carefully protect him. To all of you on the other side of the screen, I hope you can find that kind of lover, someone who places you at the absolute center of their universe, and a few true friends who genuinely have your back. Life is incredibly short. A room full of friends laughing together, with the love of your life right by your side. That is probably the ultimate form of happiness. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button for the channel. It means the absolute world to me.